Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something a little different, something that'll make you grateful for your morning commute and your office coffee. We're talking about the grossest jobs in medieval times. And when I say gross, I mean jobs so revolting, so dangerous, so utterly disgusting that they'd make a modern garbage collector look like they work in a luxury spa. Before we get started, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to hear some truly stomach-churning stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to join us for these deep dives into history's darker corners. Now, settle in, maybe grab a snack, though you might want to wait until after this video for that. We're about to explore a world where your job could literally kill you, where the smell of your work followed you home, and where society's most essential tasks were handed to people considered barely above criminals. Picture this. It's 1347 in London. The sun hasn't risen yet, and most of the city sleeps peacefully in their beds. But down in the narrow, winding streets, there's movement. A man emerges from a wooden shed, carrying buckets and shovels, his face already wrapped in cloth. He's heading to work, but his job isn't in a field or a shop. His office is a cesspit, and his task is to shovel human waste with his bare hands for the next 8 hours. This man is what they called a gong farmer, and he represents just one of dozens of professions in medieval Europe that would make your worst job seem like a vacation. These weren't jobs people chose. They were jobs people were forced into by poverty, social status, or simple bad luck. And yet, without these workers, medieval cities would have collapsed under their own filth and disease. Medieval society was built on a rigid hierarchy that made social mobility nearly impossible. At the top sat the nobility, living in castles and manor houses, concerned with war, politics, and maintaining their power. Below them came the clergy, responsible for spiritual matters and often the only literate members of society. Then came the merchants and skilled craftsmen, the bakers, blacksmiths, and carpenters who formed the backbone of medieval towns. But at the very bottom, in the shadows where polite society preferred not to look, were the people who did the jobs no one else would touch. These were the outcasts, the desperate, the condemned. People who worked with death, with waste, with disease. People whose very presence reminded others of mortality and decay. The thing is, medieval people weren't stupid. They understood that cities needed sewage removal, that dead bodies had to be buried, that leather had to be processed. They knew these jobs were essential, but they also believed that certain types of work were spiritually contaminating, that handling filth or death marked you as unclean in the eyes of God. This created a fascinating paradox. The most necessary jobs for public health became the most despised. The people who kept cities from drowning in their own waste were treated like lepers. The workers who processed the materials for clothing and shelter were forced to live downwind from everyone else. And here's where it gets really interesting. Many of these despised jobs actually paid well. A gong farmer in Tudor England could earn more in a day than a common labourer made in a week. But all the money in the world couldn't wash away the social stigma. You could be rich and still be banned from churches, refuse service at taverns, and forced to live in designated areas away from respectable people. The medieval mind had a complex relationship with cleanliness and contamination. They believed that physical filth could corrupt the soul, that certain smells could carry disease, that touching the wrong things could damn you spiritually. This wasn't entirely wrong, of course. Many of these jobs were genuinely dangerous, exposing workers to diseases we now know are transmitted through contaminated materials. But medieval people also believed in concepts we'd find strange today. They thought that bad smells, or miasma, were the primary cause of disease. They believed that certain jobs attracted evil spirits. They thought that people who worked with death or waste were somehow chosen by dark forces. This meant that workers in the grossest jobs faced a double burden. Not only did they have to endure physically demanding, dangerous, and revolting work, but they also had to live with the constant knowledge that their neighbors saw them as spiritually tainted. They were essential, but invisible, necessary, but despised. The guild system that dominated medieval crafts rarely extended to these workers. There were no proud associations of gong farmers, no ceremonial banners for plague buriers. These people worked alone or in small groups, often competing with each other for the worst jobs available. They had no political power, no legal protections, and no hope of advancement. Yet they developed their own communities, their own survival strategies, their own forms of pride. A master tanner might be shunned by polite society, but he knew his craft was essential for producing the leather that made shoes, armor, and countless other necessities. A plague burier might be seen as cursed, but he understood that his work prevented the spread of disease to the living. These workers also developed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Working in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors, they created tools, techniques, and protective measures using whatever materials were available. They learned to read the signs of dangerous gases in cesspits, to identify which animal hides carried disease, to work quickly and efficiently in environments that could kill them. The economic reality of medieval life meant that someone had to do these jobs. Cities couldn't function without waste removal. The textile industry couldn't operate without people willing to process wool in vats of stale urine. The legal system couldn't maintain order without executioners willing to carry out death sentences. But the social structure meant that these necessary workers were pushed to the absolute margins of society. They lived in the worst housing, ate the poorest food, and faced constant discrimination. Their children often inherited their occupations, trapped in cycles of social exclusion that could last for generations. What's particularly striking is how these jobs shaped entire neighborhoods and city districts. Tanners were forced to work downwind from residential areas, creating industrial zones that reeked of rotting flesh and chemical treatments. Executioners often lived near city walls or outside town limits entirely, their homes marked by symbols that warned others of their profession. The church played a complex role in the lives of these workers. While Christian doctrine preached that all honest work was dignified in God's eyes, the practical reality was that many churches refused to serve communion to people who worked with waste or death. Some priests argued that certain occupations were inherently sinful, while others maintained that any work done to serve the community was blessed. This religious tension created additional psychological pressure for workers in the grossest jobs. They needed spiritual comfort more than most people, given the dangers and hardships of their work. But they were often denied access to the very institutions that could provide it. The daily reality of these jobs was shaped by factors modern workers can barely imagine. There was no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no protective equipment beyond crude masks and gloves, no safety regulations or workers' compensation. People learned to survive through trial and error, passing down knowledge through oral tradition and bitter experience. Weather played a huge role in determining working conditions. Rain could flood cesspits, making gong farming even more treacherous. Hot summer days intensified the smells of tanning operations to unbearable levels. Winter brought different challenges, as workers had to break through ice to access water sources or work with frozen materials that could shatter unexpectedly. The tools available to medieval workers were simple but effective, crafted by blacksmiths who understood the specific needs of each trade. Gong farmers used long-handled shovels and buckets designed to be emptied quickly. Tanners had specialized knives for scraping hides and wooden paddles for stirring chemical baths. Plague buriers worked with carts, hooks for handling bodies, and lime for covering mass graves. But perhaps the most important tool these workers possessed was their knowledge of human nature. They understood that their survival depended not just on doing their jobs well, but on managing their relationships with the people who employed them and the communities that tolerated them. A successful gong farmer knew which households paid promptly and which ones tried to shortchange him. An experienced tanner could read the quality of a hide at a glance and price his work accordingly. A plague barrier learned to work quickly and quietly, avoiding unnecessary contact with grieving families or fearful neighbors. This knowledge was hard-won and carefully guarded. Competition for even the worst jobs could be fierce during economic downturns or after plagues decimated the workforce. Workers developed reputations based on their reliability, their discretion, and their ability to get unpleasant tasks done without causing additional problems. The grossest jobs also created their own hierarchies. Among gong farmers, those who worked for wealthy households or important institutions earned more respect than those who cleaned common latrines. Master tanners who owned their own workshops looked down on journeymen who worked for wages. Even in the depths of medieval society's refuse, people found ways to distinguish themselves from those they considered beneath them. These internal rankings weren't just about pride or status, they had real economic consequences. Better regarded workers got steadier employment, higher pay, and more choice in their assignments. They could afford better housing, better food, and better tools, which in turn made their work safer and more efficient. But no amount of success within these professions could overcome the fundamental social barriers that defined medieval life. A wealthy gong farmer was still a gong farmer. A master tanner was still someone who worked with rotting flesh and toxic chemicals. The stench of their work clung to them like a brand, marking them as members of society's untouchable class. Tomorrow, we'll dive deeper into the specific jobs that defined this shadow economy of medieval labor. We'll meet the gong farmers who worked waist-deep in human waste, the fullers who spent their days trampling wool in vats of stale urine, and the leech collectors who waded into stagnant marshes to let parasites feed on their blood. We'll explore not just what these jobs involved, but how the people who did them lived, survived, and found meaning in work that others couldn't even imagine. We'll see how they protected themselves from disease and danger, how they earned the grudging respect of their communities, and how they passed their knowledge and skills down to the next generation. These aren't just stories about gross jobs, they're stories about human resilience, about the people who did society's dirtiest work so that civilization could function. They're reminders that behind every medieval city, every successful merchant, every comfortable noble household, there were invisible workers laboring in conditions that would break most of us today. So stick around as we continue this journey into the underbelly of medieval life, where survival meant embracing the work that others couldn't stomach, and where dignity was found in the most unlikely places. The first job we need to talk about will make you think twice about complaining when your office bathroom runs out of soap. Meet the gong farmer, a profession so essential to medieval city life that without them, every urban centre in Europe would have drowned in its own filth within a matter of months. The name itself tells you everything you need to know. Gong was the medieval word for both a toilet and its contents. A gong farmer wasn't farming anything you'd want to eat. He was harvesting human waste from the cesspits that lay beneath every medieval home, and he did it with nothing more than buckets, shovels, and an iron stomach. Picture William the gong farmer making his way through the narrow streets of 14th century London as the church bells strike 10 in the evening. He's not allowed to work during daylight hours. The city authorities decreed that gong farmers could only operate between 9 at night and 5 in the morning, when decent people were safely tucked away in their beds and wouldn't have to witness the spectacle of their waste being carted away by the bucket load. William carries his tools in a wooden cart that creaks and groans under the weight of empty barrels. Behind him walks his apprentice, a boy of maybe 14, who's learned to breathe through his mouth whenever possible. They're heading to a merchant's house where the cesspit hasn't been cleaned in over a year. The wooden planks that cover the pit have started to bow under the weight of accumulated waste, and the merchant is worried they might collapse entirely. When they arrive, William removes the rotting boards with practiced efficiency. The smell that rises from the pit is beyond description. It's not just the odor of human waste, but the concentrated essence of decomposition, fermentation, and chemical reactions that have been brewing in the dark for months. The apprentice gags and stumbles backward. William barely reacts. After 15 years in this business, his nose has learned to shut down when necessary. The pit is roughly 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, filled almost to the brim with what medieval records delicately called night soil. William strips down to his undergarments and lowers himself into the cesspit, feeling the waste squish between his toes and rise up to his knees, then his waist, then nearly to his chest. The consistency varies, depending on how long it's been sitting. The top layer is relatively fresh and liquid. The bottom has hardened into a cake-like substance that has to be broken apart with shovels and picks. This is where the real danger begins. Cesspits produce gases that can kill a man in minutes. Hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia build up in the enclosed space, creating an atmosphere that can cause unconsciousness or death. William has learned to recognize the warning signs. If he starts feeling dizzy or nauseous, if his vision begins to blur, he knows he has seconds to get out before he collapses into the waste and drowns. The apprentice stands above with a rope tied around his waist, ready to haul William out if he signals distress. But communication is difficult when you're trying not to breathe through your nose and the person you're talking to is standing 8 feet above you. More than one gong farmer has been found face down in a cesspit, overcome by fumes that gave no warning. William fills bucket after bucket with waste, passing them up to his apprentice who empties them into the barrels on the cart. The work is backbreaking. Each bucket weighs 30 or 40 pounds when full, and William might fill 100 buckets in a single pit. His arms ache, his back screams, and the waste clings to his skin like thick mud. But the worst part isn't the physical labour, or even the smell. It's the constant fear that the walls of the cesspit might collapse. These pits were usually lined with stone or brick, but the mortar deteriorated over time, especially when exposed to the acidic conditions created by human waste. William has heard stories of gong farmers being buried alive when pit walls gave way, trapped under tons of stone and waste with no hope of rescue. Then, there's the story everyone in the profession knows by heart. Richard the Raker, a gong farmer working in London in 1326, fell through the rotting floorboards of a latrine and drowned in the cesspit below. The incident was recorded in city records, not because Richard was important, but because his death created a legal problem about who was responsible for cleaning up the mess. Richard became a cautionary tale, a reminder that this work could kill you in the most horrible way imaginable. After 4 hours of labour, William has emptied the merchant's cesspit completely. His body is coated in waste from head to toe. His hair is matted with filth, his skin stained brown and yellow. The apprentice helps him climb out, then both of them load the barrels onto their cart. They'll haul this load to the edge of the city, where it will be dumped in designated areas or sold to farmers as fertiliser. The clean-up process is almost as elaborate as the collection. William strips off his remaining clothes and throws them into a fire. He'll buy new ones tomorrow with part of his earnings. Then he washes himself in the river, scrubbing with sand and lye soap until his skin is raw. But the smell never completely goes away. It seeps into your pores, clings to your hair, follows you like a ghost. Despite the horrific nature of the work, gong farming paid extremely well. William earns more in one night than most labourers make in a week. The merchant pays him 6pence, enough to keep him fed and housed for several days. During busy periods when multiple pits need cleaning, William can earn enough to live comfortably by medieval standards. But the money comes with a price that goes beyond physical discomfort. Gong farmers are social outcasts, forbidden from living in certain areas of the city, banned from many taverns and shops. Church authorities debate whether they should be allowed to take communion since their work involves constant contact with human waste. Some priests argue that gong farmers are spiritually contaminated, while others maintain that all honest work serves God. William lives in a small house on the outskirts of London, in a neighbourhood populated by other people who work in despised professions. His neighbours include tanners, knackers who dispose of dead animals, and executioners. They form their own small community, bound together by their shared exclusion from respectable society. The tools of the gong farming trade are simple but specialised. William owns several different sizes of buckets, each designed for specific types of waste or working conditions. His shovels have long handles to keep him as far from the waste as possible, and curved blades that can scrape the hardened material from pit walls. He has hooks for pulling out objects that have fallen into the pits, ropes for hauling up heavy loads, and wooden planks for bridging narrow sections. The cart that carries the waste is built low and wide for stability, with removable barrels that can be lifted by 2 men when full. The wheels are reinforced with iron bands to handle the weight, and the whole thing is painted with pitch to make it waterproof and easier to clean. But perhaps William's most important tool is his knowledge of human nature. He knows which customers pay promptly and which ones try to haggle over prices. He understands that discretion is part of his service, that wealthy merchants don't want their neighbours to know how often their cesspits need cleaning. He's learned to work quietly, to come and go without attracting attention, to be invisible except when his services are needed. The demand for gong farmers was constant and growing. As medieval cities expanded, the waste problem became more acute. London in the 14th century had a population of around 50,000 people, all of them producing waste that had to go somewhere. The alternative to regular pit cleaning was overflowing latrines, contaminated water supplies, and disease outbreaks that could kill thousands. City authorities understood this, which is why they regulated the profession rather than banning it entirely. Laws specified when gong farmers could work, where they could dispose of waste, and how much they could charge. Some cities even employed gong farmers directly, paying them wages from tax revenue to maintain public latrines and keep the streets clean. The social stigma attached to gong farming created its own economic opportunities, because so few people were willing to do the work. Those who did could charge premium prices. William has no competition in his district of London. When someone's cesspit needs cleaning, they have to hire him or do without. This gives him leverage that most medieval workers never enjoyed. But the work takes its toll in ways that go beyond money or social status. William is 35 years old, ancient by the standards of his profession. Most gong farmers don't live past 40. The constant exposure to toxic gases damages their lungs and nervous systems. Infections from cuts and scrapes can turn deadly when you're working in human waste. The physical strain of the work breaks down joints and muscles faster than normal aging. William has trained 3 apprentices over the years. One died of lung disease at 22. Another was overcome by gases and drowned in a cesspit in Suffolk. The third found work as a street cleaner, a step up in respectability if not in pay. The current apprentice is showing promise, but William wonders how long the boy will last before the work drives him away or kills him. The seasonal nature of gong farming adds another layer of complexity to the work. Summer brings intense heat that makes the smells unbearable and accelerates decomposition. Winter freezes the waste solid, requiring picks and hammers to break it apart. Spring rains can flood cesspits, mixing waste with groundwater and creating health hazards that spread far beyond the original site. During plague years, the job becomes even more dangerous. Waste from infected households might carry the disease, though medieval people didn't understand the specific mechanisms of transmission. Gong farmers developed their own protective rituals, carrying bags of herbs, wearing amulets, or drinking special concoctions believed to ward off illness. Whether these helped is debatable, but they provided psychological comfort in a profession where death was always lurking. The apprenticeship system in gong farming was informal but essential. Boys usually entered the trade because their fathers were gong farmers, or because they had no other options for employment. The learning process was brutal but necessary. Apprentices had to master not just the physical techniques of waste removal, but the survival skills needed to work safely in toxic environments. William teaches his apprentice to read the signs of dangerous gas buildup, to recognize when pit walls are becoming unstable, to move efficiently in cramped spaces filled with waste. But he also teaches the business side of the profession, how to negotiate with customers, how to estimate the size of a job, how to collect payment from people who would rather pretend you don't exist. The equipment maintenance required for gong farming was constant and expensive. Tools exposed to human waste corroded quickly, requiring frequent replacement or repair. The barrels used to transport waste had to be thoroughly cleaned after each use, a process that itself required special tools and chemicals. Carts needed regular maintenance to handle the heavy loads and rough roads. William spends a significant portion of his earnings on equipment, but he knows that good tools can mean the difference between life and death. A bucket that breaks while he's in a deep cesspit could strand him until help arrives. A rope that snaps under tension could leave him trapped. A cart that collapses under its load could spill waste across a public street, creating a scandal that might cost him his license to operate. The licensing system for gong farmers varied from city to city, but most urban authorities required some form of official permission to operate. This wasn't about protecting public health or worker safety, concepts that barely existed in medieval times. It was about controlling who could charge fees for waste removal and ensuring that the work was done according to civic regulations. William pays an annual fee to the London authorities for his license, and he must follow strict rules about when and where he can work. Violations can result in fines, loss of license, or even imprisonment. The regulations also specify that he must live in designated areas and cannot enter certain parts of the city except when conducting business. But the license also provides protection. It gives William legal standing to collect debts from customers who refuse to pay. It prevents competitors from moving into his territory. It ensures that he has official backing when disputes arise over property damage or working conditions. The disposal of collected waste was as regulated as its collection. William cannot simply dump his loads wherever convenient. City authorities designate specific areas where night soil can be deposited, usually downwind from residential areas and away from water sources. Some of this waste is sold to farmers who use it as fertilizer, though the practice is controversial because of health concerns. The transportation of waste through city streets requires careful timing and routing. William must follow designated paths that avoid markets, churches, and wealthy residential areas. He travels only at night, when fewer people are about to witness or complain about the procession of waste-filled carts rumbling through the darkness. Even with all these precautions, accidents happen. Barrels split open, spilling their contents across cobblestones. Carts overturn on steep streets, creating messes that take hours to clean up. When these incidents occur in prominent locations, they can cause public outrage and demands for stricter regulation of the gong farming trade. The relationship between gong farmers and their customers is complex and often tense. People need William's services desperately, but they resent having to associate with him. Wealthy merchants who pride themselves on cleanliness and respectability must negotiate with a man who spends his nights chest-deep in human waste. William has learned to manage these relationships carefully. He arrives precisely when expected, works efficiently without unnecessary conversation, and leaves as quickly as possible. He never lingers or tries to socialize. He accepts payment with minimal interaction and departs without looking back. This professional distance protects both parties from embarrassment and helps maintain the fiction that respectable people don't actually produce waste. Some customers try to shortchange William, knowing that his low social status makes it difficult for him to seek legal recourse. But William has ways of dealing with dishonest clients. Word spreads quickly in the small community of gong farmers, and a merchant who cheats one waste collector may find it difficult to hire another. In extreme cases, William might simply refuse to return, leaving the customer to deal with an overflowing cesspit and the social embarrassment that follows. The health risks of gong farming extended beyond the immediate dangers of toxic gases and collapsing pits. Constant exposure to human waste led to a variety of diseases and conditions that medieval medicine could barely understand, much less treat. Skin infections were common, ranging from minor irritations to serious conditions that could become life-threatening without proper care. Respiratory problems plagued most gong farmers, caused by inhaling the gases and particles that rose from cesspits. William has developed a persistent cough that gets worse during cold weather, and he sometimes experiences difficulty breathing after particularly challenging jobs. He treats these symptoms with herbal remedies purchased from local wise women, but he knows that the damage to his lungs is probably permanent. Eye problems are another occupational hazard. The ammonia and other gases that rise from waste can cause burning, irritation, and long-term damage to vision. William has learned to work with his eyes nearly closed when conditions are particularly bad, relying on touch and experience to guide his movements in the dark depths of cesspits. The psychological toll of gong farming is harder to quantify, but no less real. William deals with constant social rejection, professional isolation, and the knowledge that his work disgusts even the people who depend on it. He's developed a thick skin and a dark sense of humour, but the cumulative effect of years of social ostracism has left its mark on his personality and worldview. Sleep doesn't come easily to someone who spends his nights in cesspits. William often lies awake after work, his body exhausted but his mind racing with memories of the evening's labours. The smells seem to follow him into his dreams, and he sometimes wakes convinced that his small house reeks of waste even though he's scrubbed himself clean. Family relationships are complicated for gong farmers. William never married, knowing that few women would accept a husband who worked in human waste. The social stigma would extend to any wife and children, limiting their opportunities and marking them as outcasts. Some gong farmers do marry, usually women from similarly despised professions, but their children often struggle to escape the cycle of social exclusion. The religious aspects of gong farming create additional complications. Medieval Christianity emphasized the dignity of honest labor, but many church authorities questioned whether working with human waste was spiritually contaminating. William attends church when he can, but he's aware that some parishioners avoid sitting near him, and that certain priests are reluctant to offer him communion. This religious uncertainty affects gong farmers' sense of self-worth and their place in the cosmic order. If honest work serves God, then William's labor should be blessed. But if contact with waste is spiritually polluting, then he might be damning himself through his profession. These theological questions have no clear answers, leaving gong farmers to wrestle with doubts about their spiritual status. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life affected gong farming in ways that went beyond weather conditions. During Lent, when people's diets changed dramatically, the composition and volume of waste shifted accordingly. Holiday periods brought increased business as wealthy households cleaned their cesspits before entertaining guests. Harvest seasons saw rural gong farmers working overtime to clear agricultural communities before winter set in. Economic fluctuations also impacted the profession. During prosperous times, people were more willing to pay for regular cesspit cleaning. But economic downturns led to deferred maintenance, creating public health hazards as overflowing pits contaminated water supplies and living spaces. These cycles created feast or famine conditions for gong farmers, who might work constantly for months and then struggle to find employment during lean periods. The competition among gong farmers was limited but intense. In a city the size of London, there might be only half a dozen licensed practitioners, each jealously guarding their territory and customer base. Disputes over boundaries or clients could turn ugly, with accusations of price cutting, service sabotage, or violations of professional ethics. William has maintained his position through a combination of reliability, discretion, and fair pricing. His customers know that he'll arrive when promised, complete the work efficiently, and keep their business confidential. This reputation has taken years to build and could be destroyed by a single serious mistake or breach of trust. The apprentice system ensures continuity in the profession, but it also creates tensions between generations. Older gong farmers like William have invested years in developing techniques, customer relationships, and survival strategies. They're reluctant to share this hard-won knowledge with younger workers who might eventually become competitors. At the same time, the physical demands of the work mean that gong farmers must eventually train replacements or see their territories go unserved. This creates a delicate balance between sharing knowledge and protecting professional interests, resolved through informal agreements and understood boundaries that maintain stability within the small community of waste collectors. The legal status of gong farmers was unique among medieval professions. They were licensed by city authorities, regulated by municipal ordinances, and subject to special restrictions that didn't apply to other workers. But they also enjoyed certain protections, including the right to collect debts, access to designated working areas, and official backing when disputes arose with customers or competitors. This semi-official status gave gong farmers a degree of security that many medieval workers lacked, but it also made them dependent on the goodwill of city authorities. Changes in government, shifts in public policy, or scandals involving the profession could quickly alter their legal standing and economic prospects. William has survived several such changes during his career, adapting to new regulations, adjusting his practices to meet shifting requirements, and maintaining the political relationships necessary to preserve his license. This requires a different set of skills than the physical labor of waste removal, but it's equally essential for long-term success in the profession. The technological aspects of gong farming remained relatively static throughout the medieval period. The basic tools and techniques used by William are essentially the same as those employed by his predecessors generations earlier. This consistency reflects both the conservative nature of medieval society and the fundamental simplicity of the work involved. Innovation in gong farming typically focused on safety improvements rather than efficiency gains. Better ropes, more durable buckets, and improved cart designs helped reduce the risk of accidents and equipment failures. But the core process of manually removing waste from cesspits remained unchanged because no alternative methods were available or economically feasible. The training required to become a competent gong farmer was extensive despite the apparent simplicity of the work. New practitioners had to learn to recognize dangerous gases by smell since they had no instruments to measure air quality. They needed to understand the structural engineering of cesspits well enough to assess collapse risks. They had to develop the physical strength and endurance necessary for hours of heavy labor in confined spaces. Most importantly, they had to overcome the natural human revulsion to working with waste. This psychological adaptation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of gong farmer training, requiring months or years of gradual exposure before new workers could function effectively in the most challenging conditions. The business aspects of gong farming required skills that went far beyond waste removal. William must estimate job costs accurately, negotiate prices with customers who would prefer not to acknowledge his existence, and collect payments from people who might try to avoid paying for services they found distasteful. Record keeping was essential, but challenging for a profession where most practitioners were illiterate. William has developed his own system of marks and symbols to track customer information, payment schedules, and equipment maintenance needs. This informal accounting system helps him manage his business efficiently despite his limited formal education. The seasonal storage of equipment presented unique challenges for gong farmers. Tools exposed to waste corroded rapidly and had to be stored in ways that prevented further deterioration while minimizing odors that might attract complaints from neighbors. William keeps his equipment in a small shed behind his house, cleaned and oiled to extend its useful life. The procurement of new tools and equipment required careful budgeting and timing. A broken shovel or damaged bucket could put William out of work until replacements were obtained. But the specialized nature of gong farming equipment meant that items couldn't always be purchased immediately. William maintained small stockpiles of essential tools to prevent work interruptions caused by equipment failures. The disposal of worn-out equipment created additional complications. Tools contaminated with human waste couldn't simply be discarded or sold to other workers. They had to be destroyed or buried in designated areas, representing a complete loss of the original investment. This disposal cost was factored into William's pricing structure, but it added to the overall expense of operating in the profession. The networking among gong farmers was informal but essential for professional survival. Information about dangerous working conditions, dishonest customers, and new opportunities spread through word-of-mouth communication among the small community of waste collectors. This informal intelligence network helped practitioners avoid hazards and identify profitable work. Professional relationships extended beyond simple information sharing to include mutual assistance during emergencies. When a gong farmer was injured or incapacitated, colleagues might temporarily cover his territory to prevent customers from switching to competitors. This cooperation was based on enlightened self-interest rather than altruism, but it provided a form of professional insurance in a dangerous occupation. The reputation management required for gong farming success involved balancing visibility and discretion. William needed to be known to potential customers as a reliable service provider, but he also had to maintain a low profile to avoid attracting negative attention from authorities or respectable citizens who might object to his presence in their neighborhoods. This delicate balance was maintained through careful attention to professional conduct, strategic timing of business activities, and cultivation of relationships with intermediaries who could recommend his services without direct association. The most successful gong farmers became known for their reliability and discretion rather than their personalities or social connections. Tomorrow, we'll meet the fullers, men and women who spent their working days literally stomping through vats of stale urine to clean wool for the textile industry. Their work was essential to medieval Europe's most important manufacturing sector, but the conditions they endured would make even our gong farmer grateful for his outdoor working environment. But while gong farmers dealt with waste after it was produced, there was another group of workers who spent their entire working lives submerged in human urine, and they did it not to clean up messes, but to create some of the finest textiles in medieval Europe. Meet the fullers and prepare yourself for a job that somehow managed to combine backbreaking labour with absolutely revolting working conditions in service of medieval fashion. Thomas the Fuller stands knee-deep in a wooden vat that's roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, filled with what looks like murky brown water, but smells like the worst public latrine you've ever encountered. The liquid sloshing around his bare legs isn't water at all. It's stale human urine that's been sitting in collection barrels for weeks, fermenting and decomposing until it reaches the perfect chemical composition for cleaning wool. His job is simple in concept, but nauseating in execution. He must stomp on raw wool for hours at a time, working it with his feet until the natural oils, dirt, and debris are removed, leaving behind clean fibers that can be spun into thread and woven into cloth. The process is called fulling, and without it, medieval Europe's most important industry would collapse overnight. Thomas has been doing this work for 12 years, ever since his father died and left him the family business. He starts each day before dawn, when the air is still cool and the smell isn't quite as overwhelming. By the time the sun rises, he'll be waist-deep in urine, his feet pruned and stained, his body aching from the constant motion required to work the wool properly. The science behind fulling is actually quite clever, though the medieval fullers who practiced it didn't understand the chemistry involved. When urine sits for several weeks, bacteria break down the urea into ammonia, creating a powerful cleaning agent that can dissolve the lanolin and other oils that coat raw wool. The ammonia also has mild bleaching properties, helping to brighten the fibers and prepare them for dyeing. But understanding the science doesn't make the work any less revolting. Thomas spends 8 to 10 hours a day standing in fermented urine, breathing its fumes, feeling it seep into every pore of his skin. The ammonia burns his eyes and throat, causes his feet to crack and bleed, and leaves him with a persistent cough that gets worse every winter. The wool itself adds another layer of unpleasantness to the work. Raw fleece comes straight from the sheep, complete with bits of dung, burrs, insects, and whatever else the animal has picked up while grazing. When this debris mixes with stale urine and gets worked by stomping feet, it creates a soup of organic matter that defies description. Thomas works with a rhythm developed over years of practice. Step, lift, step, turn, step, lift, step, turn. He uses his feet like hands, grasping the wool between his toes, lifting it, folding it, working it until every fibre has been thoroughly cleaned. The motion is hypnotic, almost dance-like, but the dancer is performing in a vat of human waste. The fulling process requires different techniques for different types of wool. Fine fleece from young sheep needs gentle handling to avoid damaging the delicate fibres. Coarse wool from older animals can withstand more aggressive treatment. Thomas has learned to read wool the way a baker reads dough, adjusting his technique based on the texture, colour, and condition of each batch. The physical demands of fulling are enormous. Standing in liquid for hours causes the feet to swell and the skin to soften and tear. The constant motion required to work the wool strains the legs, back and arms. The fumes from the urine cause headaches, dizziness, and respiratory problems. Many fullers develop chronic health conditions that plague them for life. Thomas works alone in his small fulling mill, a stone building located downwind from the village centre. The building has thick walls to contain the smell and small windows to provide minimal ventilation. Inside, 6 wooden vats line the walls, each one designed for a different stage of the fulling process. The newest urine goes in the first vat, while the oldest, most potent mixture is reserved for the final cleaning. The collection of urine for fulling was a community effort that reveals just how essential this disgusting process was to medieval life. Every household in Thomas's village contributes to the supply, emptying chamber pots into designated collection barrels placed strategically around town. The barrels are collected weekly by Thomas's apprentice, a boy of 15 who hasn't yet learned to breathe through his mouth while working. But not all urine was considered equal. The best fulling liquid came from healthy adults who drank ale rather than water. Children's urine was too weak, while urine from sick people might contain substances that could damage the wool. Pregnant women's urine was particularly prized for its higher concentration of hormones, though medieval fullers didn't understand why it worked better than other types. The storage and preparation of urine required careful attention to timing and temperature. Fresh urine was useless for fulling because it hadn't developed the necessary chemical properties. But urine that was too old became too harsh and could damage the wool fibres. Thomas has learned to judge the readiness of his supply by smell, colour, and the way it feels against his skin. The apprenticeship system in fulling was brutal but necessary. Boys usually started around age 12, beginning with simple tasks like collecting urine and maintaining equipment. Gradually, they were introduced to the actual fulling process, starting with coarse wool that could withstand mistakes and working their way up to fine fleeces that required expert handling. Thomas remembers his own apprenticeship with a mixture of nostalgia and horror. His master was a harsh man who believed that the only way to learn fulling was through constant practice and frequent beatings. Thomas spent his first year vomiting daily from the smell, his second year developing the calluses and tolerance necessary to work effectively. and his third year finally mastering the subtle techniques that separated skilled fullers from mere labourers. The apprentice system also served as a form of quality control. Experienced fullers could spot problems immediately, whether it was wool that wasn't clean enough, urine that had gone bad, or technique errors that might damage valuable materials. This knowledge was passed down through generations of fullers, creating a body of practical expertise that couldn't be learned from books. The social status of fullers was complicated and contradictory. Their work was essential to the textile industry, which was one of the medieval Europe's most important economic sectors. Cloth production employed thousands of people, from shepherds and shearers to weavers and dyers. Without fullers, none of this economic activity could exist, but the nature of their work marked them as unclean in both literal and spiritual senses. Thomas lives in a house located downwind from the village, along with other workers in smelly professions like tanners and dyers. His neighbours avoid him when possible, and he's banned from certain taverns and shops. Children run away when they see him coming, holding their noses and making exaggerated faces of disgust. The church's attitude toward fullers was ambivalent. Christian doctrine taught that all honest labour was blessed by God, but many priests questioned whether work that involved constant contact with human waste could be truly clean. Some churches refused to allow fullers to take communion unless they had undergone special purification rituals. Others maintained that the spiritual value of work lay in its necessity rather than its cleanliness. This religious uncertainty created additional psychological stress for workers like Thomas. He attends church when he can, but he's always aware of the other parishioners shifting away from him, covering their noses, whispering comments about his profession. He wonders sometimes whether his work is damning his soul, whether the smell that clings to him marks him as spiritually contaminated. The economic aspects of fulling were more straightforward. Thomas charges by the weight of wool processed, with premium rates for fine fleeces that require extra care. He also offers additional services like preliminary cleaning for heavily soiled wool or rush jobs that require working through the night. During peak seasons, when merchants need large quantities of cloth processed quickly, Thomas can earn enough to live comfortably for months. But the work is seasonal and unpredictable. During the summer, when sheep are sheared, Thomas might work 16 hours a day to keep up with demand. In winter, when wool production slows, he might go weeks without steady employment. This feast or famine cycle requires careful budgeting and forces Thomas to take on additional work during slow periods. The equipment required for fulling was relatively simple, but required constant maintenance. The wooden vats had to be scrubbed regularly to prevent the buildup of residues that could contaminate future batches. The stone floors needed frequent cleaning to remove spilled urine and wool debris. The building itself required repairs to maintain proper ventilation and prevent structural damage from the corrosive effects of ammonia. Thomas owns 6 wooden vats of different sizes, each designed for specific types of work. He has long-handled paddles for stirring wool, hooks for lifting heavy fleeces, and screens for straining out debris. His most important tools are his feet, which he protects with special preparations of animal fat and herbs to prevent cracking and infection. The seasonal rhythms of fulling work created their own calendar of hardships and opportunities. Spring brought the first wool of the year, often heavily soiled from winter conditions. Summer was the busiest season, with fresh fleeces arriving daily from sheep shearing operations. Fall meant processing the last wool before winter, often working in increasingly cold conditions. Winter offered a chance to repair equipment and prepare for the next year's work. Weather conditions significantly affected fulling operations. Rain could flood the mill, mixing clean and dirty water and ruining entire batches of wool. Hot weather intensified the smell to unbearable levels and accelerated the decomposition of urine beyond the optimal point. Cold weather made the work even more miserable, as Thomas had to stand in freezing liquid while maintaining the precise movements necessary for proper fulling. the health risks of fulling extended beyond the obvious problems of working in human waste. The repetitive motion required for the work caused joint problems, particularly in the feet, ankles, and knees. The constant exposure to ammonia damaged the respiratory system and eyes. Cuts and scrapes on the feet could become infected when exposed to the bacteria-rich environment of the fulling vats. Thomas has developed a variety of protective measures over the years. He rubs his feet with animal fat before work to create a barrier against the urine. He burns herbs in the mill to mask the smell and supposedly purify the air. He drinks special teas made from plants believed to counteract the effects of ammonia exposure. Whether these remedies actually help is debatable, but they provide psychological comfort in a profession that offers few other consolations. The quality control required in fulling was exacting and unforgiving. Wool that wasn't cleaned properly would produce inferior cloth that could be rejected by buyers. Wool that was damaged during fulling represented a complete loss for everyone involved in the production chain. Thomas has learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when wool is properly cleaned, when the process should be stopped, and when adjustments need to be made. The grading system for fulled wool was complex and based on factors that weren't always obvious to outsiders. The cleanliness of the fibers was paramount, but so was their condition after processing. Wool that was clean but damaged was less valuable than wool that was slightly less clean but intact. Thomas has developed an eye for these distinctions that allows him to maximize the value of each batch he processes. The business relationships required for successful fulling involved managing connections with multiple types of clients. Wealthy merchants who dealt in fine cloth expected premium service and were willing to pay higher prices. Local weavers needed reliable, affordable processing for everyday materials. Occasional customers with small amounts of wool required different handling than regular clients with large, consistent orders. Thomas has learned to read his customers as carefully as he reads wool. He knows which merchants pay promptly and which ones try to delay payment. He understands that discretion is part of his service, that wealthy clients don't want their neighbors to know they're dealing with someone who works in human waste. He's developed the ability to be simultaneously professional and invisible, present when needed, but otherwise unnoticed. The competition among fullers was limited but intense. In a region that could support only a few fulling operations, reputation and reliability were everything. Thomas competes not just on price, but on quality, speed, and discretion. He's built his business by being consistently available, maintaining high standards, and keeping his customers' business confidential. The apprentice currently working with Thomas shows promise, but struggles with the physical demands of the work. The boy is thin and weak, lacking the leg strength needed for hours of stomping. He vomits daily from the smell and has developed a persistent rash on his feet and legs. Thomas wonders whether the apprentice will last long enough to learn the trade, or whether he'll follow the example of previous apprentices who found other work rather than endure the conditions required for fulling success. The training process for fulling involved more than just learning to stomp on wool. Apprentices had to understand the chemistry of urine decomposition, the properties of different types of wool, the effects of weather and temperature on the process, and the business skills needed to deal with customers. This knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, with each master fuller adding his own insights and techniques to the collective wisdom of the profession. The social isolation experienced by fullers was profound and lasting. Thomas has few friends outside the community of workers in similarly despised professions. He's never married, knowing that few women would accept a husband who smelled permanently of stale urine. His social life revolves around a tavern that caters to tanners, dyers, and other workers whose occupations mark them as unclean. But within this community of outcasts, Thomas has found acceptance and even respect. His fellow pariahs understand the challenges of working in conditions that disgust respectable society. They share information about customers, techniques, and opportunities. They provide mutual support during difficult times and celebrate each other's successes without judgment or jealousy. The psychological adaptation required for fulling work was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the profession. New workers had to overcome not just physical revulsion, but social shame, spiritual doubt, and the constant awareness that their neighbours found them disgusting. This mental adjustment could take years and wasn't always successful. Thomas has developed a form of professional pride that helps him endure the daily humiliations of his work. He knows that the cloth produced through his efforts will be worn by nobles and wealthy merchants. He understands that his skill and dedication contribute to one of Europe's most important industries. He takes satisfaction in doing difficult work well, even if that work involves standing waist-deep in human waste. The technological aspects of fulling remained relatively unchanged throughout the medieval period, though some improvements were made to increase efficiency and reduce the physical demands on workers. Water-powered fulling mills began appearing in some regions, using mechanical hammers to pound wool instead of human feet. But these innovations were expensive and not always available, leaving most fullers dependent on traditional methods. Thomas has heard about mechanical fulling mills, but has never seen one in operation. The nearest water-powered mill is 2 days' travel away, and its services are reserved for large commercial operations that can afford the higher fees. For now, Thomas continues to rely on his feet, his experience, and his ability to endure conditions that would break most people. The disposal of used fulling liquid created environmental problems that medieval communities struggled to address. The spent urine couldn't simply be dumped into rivers or wells because it would contaminate water supplies. But finding acceptable disposal sites was challenging, especially in densely populated areas where every piece of land had multiple competing uses. Thomas disposes of his used fulling liquid in a designated area outside the village, where it's supposed to soak into the ground harmlessly. But the volume of waste produced by his operation means that the disposal site is always saturated, creating runoff that sometimes reaches streams and wells. Complaints from downstream neighbours are common, leading to ongoing tensions between fullers and the communities they serve. The regulation of fulling operations varied from place to place, but most communities had rules governing where fulling mills could be located, how waste could be disposed of, and what safety measures had to be maintained. These regulations were often honoured, more in the breach than in the observance, but they provided a framework for addressing problems when they arose. Thomas holds a licence from the local authorities that permits him to operate his fulling mill, but the licence comes with restrictions and obligations. He must maintain certain standards of cleanliness, dispose of waste in approved areas, and submit to periodic inspections. Violations can result in fines, temporary closure, or permanent loss of his licence to operate. The seasonal storage of materials required for fulling presented unique challenges. Urine had to be stored in covered containers to prevent contamination and control odours, but the containers themselves became sources of problems as they corroded and leaked. Wool had to be protected from moisture, insects, and rodents while waiting to be processed. Equipment had to be cleaned and maintained during periods of low activity. Thomas spends considerable time and money on storage solutions, but the corrosive nature of his materials means that containers and buildings require frequent replacement. The stone walls of his mill show signs of deterioration from ammonia exposure, and the wooden vats need constant repair to prevent leaks and structural failure. The procurement of raw materials for fulling required maintaining relationships with multiple suppliers. Urine came from the local community, but consistent quality and quantity weren't guaranteed. Wool came from sheep farmers and merchants, but supply could be interrupted by disease, weather, or economic disruption. Additional materials like herbs for masking odours or fats for protecting feet had to be purchased from specialised suppliers. Thomas has developed a network of suppliers that provides some security against disruptions, but he's always vulnerable to changes in availability or pricing. A bad harvest might reduce the supply of certain herbs. Disease among sheep could limit wool production. Changes in trade routes might affect the availability of imported materials. The record-keeping required for fulling operations was essential, but challenging for practitioners who were often illiterate. Thomas has developed his own system of marks and symbols to track customer orders, material supplies, and financial transactions. This informal accounting system helps him manage his business efficiently despite his limited formal education. The marketing of fulling services required balancing visibility with discretion. Thomas needed potential customers to know about his services, but he also had to avoid attracting negative attention from authorities or neighbors who might object to his operations. Word-of-mouth recommendations were crucial, but they had to be managed carefully to avoid creating problems. Thomas relies heavily on referrals from satisfied customers and relationships with merchants who need his services regularly. He avoids advertising his business openly, instead depending on the network of connections that exists within the textile industry. This approach limits his potential customer base, but provides some protection against the social and legal problems that could arise from higher visibility. The insurance against business risks available to medieval fullers was limited to informal arrangements with colleagues and family members. Thomas has agreements with other fullers to cover each other's territories during illness or injury, but these arrangements provide only basic protection against business disruption. The succession planning for fulling operations was complicated by the social stigma attached to the profession. Thomas has no children to inherit his business, and finding qualified successors among young people willing to enter such a despised profession is increasingly difficult. The knowledge and skills he's developed over years of practice may die with him unless he can successfully train apprentices who will stay in the profession. The environmental impact of fulling operations extended beyond immediate waste disposal problems. The concentration of ammonia-rich waste in disposal areas could affect soil chemistry and plant growth for years. The runoff from fulling mills could contaminate water sources miles downstream. The odours produced by fulling operations could affect property values and quality of life in surrounding areas. Thomas is aware of these environmental problems, but has limited options for addressing them. The economic necessity of his work, combined with the lack of alternative disposal methods, means that environmental damage is an unavoidable consequence of fulling operations. He tries to minimize problems through careful waste management, but the fundamental nature of his work ensures that environmental impact will continue. The technological innovation in fulling was limited by the conservative nature of medieval society and the lack of understanding about the chemical processes involved. Improvements typically focused on small modifications to existing techniques rather than fundamental changes to the process. Thomas has made minor adjustments to his vats and tools over the years, but the basic method he uses is essentially the same as that employed by fullers centuries earlier. The future prospects for fulling as a profession were uncertain even during Thomas's lifetime. Mechanical innovations threatened to replace human labour, while changes in textile production methods might reduce demand for traditional fulling services. Economic disruptions, political changes, and social reforms could all affect the viability of fulling operations. Thomas worries about the long-term sustainability of his profession, but he has few alternatives available. His skills are specific to fulling and don't transfer easily to other occupations. His social status makes it difficult to enter more respectable professions. His age and health problems limit his ability to learn new trades or relocate to areas with better opportunities. But despite all these challenges and uncertainties, Thomas continues his work with a kind of grim determination. Every morning, he enters his mill, fills his vats with stale urine, and begins the process of stomping wool clean. He endures the smell, the social rejection, and the physical discomfort because he has no choice, and because he's found a form of dignity in doing necessary work that others cannot or will not do. The fuller's story reminds us that behind every piece of medieval cloth Every garment worn by noble or peasant lay hours of back-breaking labour performed in conditions that would appall modern workers. The smooth wool that emerged from Thomas's vats would become fine cloth, traded across Europe, worn by people who never thought about the man who stood waist-deep in urine to make their clothing possible. Tomorrow, we'll meet another group of workers whose job involved direct contact with death and disease on a scale that dwarfs even the unpleasantness of fulling. During the plague years that periodically swept across medieval Europe, a new profession emerged, the plague burier. Men and women who collected the bodies of the dead and disposed of them in mass graves while risking their own lives with every corpse they handled. But if you thought fulling was the limit of how revolting medieval work could get, you haven't met the leech collectors yet. These brave or desperate souls made their living by wading into stagnant marshes and allowing blood-sucking parasites to attach to their bare legs, then harvesting the engorged creatures to sell to physicians and barber surgeons across Europe. Margaret the leech collector stands waist-deep in the murky waters of a fenland bog outside Canterbury, her woolen skirts hiked up and tied around her waist to keep them dry. The water is cold even in summer, tinted brown with decomposing vegetation and alive with insects that buzz around her face in thick clouds. But the insects are the least of her concerns. She's been standing motionless for 20 minutes now, letting the marsh do its work. Beneath the dark water, she can feel them, dozens of leeches attaching themselves to her calves, thighs and feet. Each attachment brings a sharp pinch followed by a strange numbness as the creature's saliva numbs the wound. She's learned not to flinch or move suddenly, as disturbing the water will scatter the leeches before they've had time to feed properly. The demand for leeches in medieval medicine was enormous. Physicians believed that most illnesses were caused by an imbalance of bodily humours, and bloodletting was considered the primary treatment for everything from headaches to plague. Leeches were preferred over crude bleeding tools because they could extract blood gradually and supposedly knew when to stop feeding. This made them valuable commodities, and leech collectors like Margaret could earn decent money if they were willing to endure the physical and psychological toll of the work. Margaret carries a canvas sack slung over her shoulder, already containing 24 leeches collected from earlier sites. The bag squirms and shifts with their movement, a sensation that took her months to get used to. She's been working as a leech collector for 5 years now, ever since her husband died in a mill accident and left her with 3 children to feed. The work pays better than most occupations available to women, but it comes with risks that go far beyond the obvious discomfort of being repeatedly bitten by parasites. The marshes where leeches thrive are dangerous places. The ground is unstable, with hidden holes and soft spots that can trap an unwary collector. Snakes are common, drawn to the same warm, wet conditions that leeches prefer. Margaret has been bitten twice by venomous serpents, surviving both encounters but suffering weeks of illness that prevented her from working. The water itself harbours diseases that can enter through the numerous wounds left by leech bites, causing infections that can turn fatal without proper treatment. But perhaps the most serious risk comes from the leeches themselves. Each creature that attaches to Margaret's legs will feed for 20 to 30 minutes, consuming several times its body weight in blood. When it finally releases, the wound continues to bleed for hours due to anticoagulants in the leech's saliva. On a productive day, Margaret might have 50 or 60 leeches feeding on her simultaneously, resulting in significant blood loss that leaves her weak, dizzy, and vulnerable to fainting. The physical toll of leech collecting extends beyond immediate blood loss. Margaret suffers from chronic anemia that makes her constantly tired and susceptible to illness. Her legs are covered with scars from thousands of leech bites, some of which became infected and left permanent marks. The repeated exposure to cold, stagnant water has given her joint problems that worsen every winter. At 32, she moves like a woman twice her age, her body worn down by years of deliberate parasitic feeding. The collection process requires patience, skill, and an iron constitution. Margaret has learned to identify the best collecting sites by reading subtle signs in the water and vegetation. Leeches prefer areas with slow-moving or stagnant water, plenty of organic debris, and adequate shade. They're most active during warm weather and after rainfall, when water levels rise and bring fresh nutrients into their habitat. When Margaret finds a promising location, she enters the water slowly and stands perfectly still, allowing her body heat and movement to attract leeches from the surrounding area. She's learned to distinguish between different species by the sensation of their bite. Medicinal leeches, the most valuable variety, have a distinctive 3-part bite that creates a Y-shaped wound. Smaller species are less valuable, but still marketable to physicians who can't afford premium specimens. The harvesting process requires careful timing. Leeches that haven't fed enough won't survive long enough to reach market, while those that have gorged themselves become sluggish and difficult to handle. Margaret monitors each leech by touch, feeling for the swelling that indicates proper feeding. When a leech reaches the right size, she carefully detaches it and places it in her collection bag, trying not to damage the creature or cause it to regurgitate its blood meal. The business side of leech collecting involves managing relationships with multiple types of customers. Physicians in Canterbury pay the highest prices for prime specimens, but they're also the most demanding about quality and freshness. Barber surgeons in smaller towns pay less but buy in larger quantities and are less particular about individual leeches. Travelling healers and folk practitioners represent a steady but low-paying market for damaged or inferior specimens. Margaret has learned to grade her leeches carefully, sorting them by size, species, and condition. The largest, healthiest medicinal leeches go to wealthy physicians who treat noble patients. Medium-sized specimens are sold to town doctors and barber surgeons. Smaller leeches, and those that are slightly damaged, go to rural healers and folk practitioners. Even dead leeches have some value, as they can be ground up and used in various medicinal preparations. The transportation of live leeches presents unique challenges. The creatures must be kept moist but not waterlogged, cool but not frozen, and contained but not crushed. Margaret uses specially designed containers made of perforated pottery that allow air circulation while preventing escape. The containers are packed with damp moss or cloth that provides moisture without drowning the leeches. During hot weather, she must travel quickly to prevent her cargo from dying before reaching market. The seasonal nature of leech collecting creates periods of feast and famine that require careful financial planning. Spring and summer bring peak collecting conditions, when leeches are most active and accessible. During these months, Margaret might work 16-hour days to take advantage of optimal conditions. Fall brings declining activity as leeches prepare for winter dormancy. Winter offers little opportunity for collecting, forcing Margaret to survive on savings or find alternative employment. The social status of leech collectors was ambiguous and often contradictory. Their work was essential to medical practice, which gave them some legitimacy and protection. But the nature of their occupation, involving deliberate parasitic feeding and contact with stagnant water, marked them as unclean in the eyes of many community members. Margaret faces suspicion from neighbours who see her scarred legs and assume she's been afflicted with some mysterious disease. The church's attitude toward leech collecting was similarly complex. Some priests argued that allowing parasites to feed on one's body was a form of self-harm that violated Christian principles. Others maintained that work performed in service of healing was blessed by God, regardless of its unpleasant nature. Margaret attends church when she can, but she's aware of other parishioners avoiding contact with her and whispering about her profession. The health risks of leech collecting extended beyond blood loss and infection. The stagnant waters where leeches lived harboured numerous diseases that could be transmitted through the wounds left by feeding parasites. Margaret has suffered from various waterborne illnesses over the years, including fevers, digestive problems, and skin conditions that medical practitioners couldn't properly diagnose or treat. The psychological adaptation required for leech collecting was perhaps as challenging as the physical demands. Margaret had to overcome natural revulsion at allowing parasites to feed on her body, anxiety about working in dangerous marsh environments, and the social isolation that came with practicing a profession many people found disgusting. The sight of dozens of blood-gorged leeches attached to her legs never became comfortable, but she learned to endure it as the price of survival. The equipment used in leech collecting was simple but specialized. Margaret owns several types of collection containers designed for different situations. She has long-handled nets for gathering leeches from areas too deep or dangerous to enter directly. Her clothing is modified for easy removal and quick drying, essential when working in wet conditions. She carries medicinal herbs believed to prevent infection and promote healing of leech wounds. The knowledge required for successful leech collecting went far beyond simply standing in marsh water. Margaret has learned to read weather patterns that affect leech activity, to identify the subtle signs that indicate productive collecting sites, and to distinguish between valuable species and worthless varieties. She understands the life cycle of leeches well enough to predict where and when they'll be most abundant. The competition among leech collectors was fierce, but generally civil. The best collecting sites were jealously guarded secrets, passed down through families or discovered through years of exploration. Margaret has agreements with other collectors that prevent conflicts over territory, but these arrangements are informal and depend on mutual respect and restraint. The apprenticeship system in leech collecting was informal and dangerous. Margaret learned the trade from an older woman who took pity on her desperate circumstances, but the training process involved immediate exposure to all the risks and discomforts of the profession. There was no gradual introduction to leech feeding or protective period while skills were developed. New collectors either adapted quickly or found other work. The storage and care of collected leeches required constant attention and specialized knowledge. Margaret maintains her leeches in conditions that keep them healthy and active until they can be sold. This involves regular feeding, cleaning of containers, and monitoring for signs of disease or stress. Leeches that die in storage represent a complete loss of time and effort invested in their collection. The pricing of leeches varied based on numerous factors, including size, species, condition, season, and local demand. Margaret has learned to negotiate with customers who often try to reduce prices by claiming specimens are inferior or unnecessary. She's developed relationships with regular buyers who pay fair prices for consistent quality, but she must also cultivate new customers to maintain income stability. The disposal of damaged or unsaleable leeches created minor but persistent problems. Dead leeches couldn't simply be thrown away, as they might contaminate water supplies or attract scavengers. Margaret typically buries unusable specimens or burns them, but both methods require time and effort that reduces the efficiency of her operation. The record-keeping required for leech collecting was minimal but important for tracking seasonal patterns and customer preferences. Margaret maintains mental records of productive sites, successful collection times, and customer payment histories. This information helps her plan collecting trips efficiently and avoid customers who don't pay promptly. The marketing of leeches required understanding medical practices and customer needs. Margaret has learned which physicians prefer large specimens for major bloodletting procedures and which ones need smaller leeches for delicate work. She knows that barber surgeons often buy in bulk for routine procedures, while specialist healers might need specific varieties for particular treatments. The preservation of leeches for longer-term storage was limited by medieval technology. Margaret can keep specimens alive for several days under optimal conditions, but extended storage usually results in deterioration or death. This creates pressure to sell quickly and limits her ability to stockpile inventory during peak collecting seasons. The transportation logistics for leech collecting involved careful route planning to minimize travel time while maximizing sales opportunities. Margaret typically visits multiple customers during each sales trip, arranging her route to deliver the freshest specimens to the highest-paying customers first. The weight and fragility of her containers limit how much she can carry on each trip. The insurance against business risks available to leech collectors was limited to informal arrangements with family and community members. Margaret has agreements with other women who will care for her children if she's injured while working, but she has no protection against loss of income due to illness or accident. The dangerous nature of her work makes such risks constant concerns. The environmental knowledge required for leech collecting was extensive and constantly evolving. Margaret understands how rainfall, temperature, and seasonal changes affect leech populations. She knows which plants and animals indicate good collecting conditions, and which signs suggest that an area should be avoided. This ecological knowledge was gained through experience and observation rather than formal education. The legal status of leech collecting was generally unregulated, but collectors sometimes faced restrictions on access to certain areas. Margaret occasionally encounters problems with landowners who object to her presence in their marshes, though most recognize that her work serves a valuable medical purpose. Some communities have designated certain areas for leech collecting to prevent conflicts with other land uses. The succession planning for leech collecting knowledge was informal and often interrupted by the dangers of the profession. Margaret hopes to train one of her daughters in the trade, but she's also aware that the work might kill or disable her before the training is complete. The specialized knowledge she's accumulated over years of practice could be lost if she's unable to pass it on effectively. The innovation in leech collecting techniques was limited by the conservative nature of medieval society and the fundamental simplicity of the work involved. Margaret has made minor improvements to her containers and collection methods, but the basic process remains unchanged from techniques used by previous generations. The focus is on reliability and safety rather than revolutionary changes to established practices. The quality control required in leech collecting was essential for maintaining customer relationships and ensuring specimen effectiveness. Margaret has learned to identify diseased or damaged leeches that might not perform properly in medical applications. She culls inferior specimens before they reach customers, even though this reduces her immediate income, because reputation is crucial for long-term success. The weather dependency of leech collecting created significant income variability that required careful financial management. Extended dry periods could eliminate collecting opportunities for weeks at a time, while early freezes might end the collecting season prematurely. Margaret has learned to save money during productive periods to survive lean times when collecting is impossible. The geographical knowledge required for successful leech collecting extended beyond individual sites to encompass entire watersheds and regional weather patterns. Margaret understands how conditions in distant areas might affect local leech populations, allowing her to predict productive collecting opportunities or potential shortages. This regional perspective helps her plan collecting activities more effectively. The customer service aspects of leech collecting involved more than simply delivering live specimens. Margaret provides advice about leech care and handling, helps customers select appropriate specimens for specific medical procedures, and sometimes offers instruction in basic bloodletting techniques. These additional services help differentiate her from competitors and justify higher prices. The waste management issues associated with leech collecting were minimal, but required attention to prevent contamination of collecting sites. Margaret is careful not to leave dead leeches or container materials in marsh areas where they might affect water quality or leech populations. She also avoids over-harvesting from any single location to ensure continued productivity. The networking among leech collectors was essential for sharing information about productive sites, market conditions, and safety hazards. Margaret maintains relationships with other collectors that provide mutual support and information exchange. These connections help her avoid dangerous areas identify new collecting opportunities, and stay informed about changes in customer demand. The adaptation to changing market conditions required flexibility and business acumen that went beyond collecting skills. Margaret monitors demand from different types of customers and adjusts her collecting priorities accordingly. When physicians reduce their leech purchases, she might focus more on barber surgeons or folk healers who continue buying despite economic changes. But even as Margaret endures the daily misery of her profession, allowing parasites to feed on her blood while standing in stagnant water that harbours countless diseases, she knows her work serves an essential medical function. The leeches she collects will be used to treat patients suffering from conditions that medieval physicians genuinely believe require bloodletting. Her sacrifice of blood and health contributes to what her society considers legitimate medical care. The irony isn't lost on her that she deliberately harms herself to provide tools for healing others. Every leech bite weakens her while potentially helping restore someone else's health. It's a transaction that reveals both the desperation of her circumstances and the strange logic of medieval medicine, where health and illness, healing and harm, often existed in uncomfortable proximity. Tomorrow we'll encounter another profession that dealt intimately with death and disease, but on a scale that dwarfs even the risks faced by leech collectors. During the plague years that periodically devastated medieval Europe, a new type of worker emerged from necessity: the plague burier, men and women who collected the bodies of the dead and disposed of them in mass graves while facing mortality rates that made their profession almost suicidal. But before we meet those who handle death on an industrial scale, let's visit the tanners, whose work with rotting animal flesh created some of the most revolting working conditions in medieval Europe while producing leather goods essential to daily life. Edmund the Tanner awakens before dawn in his small house, located deliberately downwind from the village of Rouen. The acrid smell of his trade already filling his nostrils before he's fully conscious. The smell never leaves him completely. It clings to his hair, soaks into his clothing, and permeates every surface of his home. His wife died 3 years ago. Whether from the constant exposure to the chemicals and odours of his trade, or simply from the misery of living with them, he's never been sure. The tanning yard behind his house is a maze of stone-lined pits filled with liquids in various stages of decomposition and chemical treatment. Some contain fresh hides soaking in lime water to loosen hair and flesh. Others hold skins submerged in solutions of ground oak bark and water that will slowly transform raw hide into leather through a process that takes months to complete. The largest pits contain the most revolting mixture of all: animal dung, urine, and water fermenting into a bacterial soup that softens leather and gives it the proper texture. Edmund's day begins with checking the pits that hold hides in their initial soaking stage. The lime water used to prepare fresh skins creates a caustic solution that can burn exposed skin and produces fumes that make his eyes water and his throat burn. He uses long wooden poles to lift and turn the hides, but splashing is inevitable, and by the end of each day, his arms and hands are covered with chemical burns that heal slowly and leave permanent scars. The raw materials for Edmund's trade arrive in various states of decay. Freshly slaughtered animals provide the best hides, but much of his supply comes from animals that died of disease or accident, their skins already beginning to decompose when they reach his yard. These inferior hides require more aggressive treatment to remove putrefied flesh and blood, a process that fills the air with smells so intense that Edmund has learned to work while breathing through his mouth as much as possible. The first stage of tanning involves removing hair and flesh from the raw hides. Edmund uses curved knives to scrape away material that clings to the skin, working over wooden beams that are slick with grease and blood. The scraping process generates piles of organic waste that attract flies, rats, and other scavengers. The waste must be disposed of regularly, but finding acceptable dumping sites is increasingly difficult as the village expands and neighbours complain about contamination of their land. After the initial cleaning, Hides are moved to the baiting pits, where they're submerged in solutions of animal dung and water. The bacterial action in these pits breaks down remaining organic matter and softens the leather, but it also creates an environment so foul that even Edmund, after 15 years in the trade, sometimes has to step away to avoid vomiting. The fermentation process produces gases that can cause headaches, dizziness, and respiratory problems with prolonged exposure. The baiting process requires constant attention and adjustment. Edmund must monitor the temperature and acidity of each pit, adding fresh dung or lime as needed to maintain optimal conditions. Different types of dung produce different results. Dog dung creates the softest leather but smells the worst, while pigeon dung works more quickly but requires careful timing to prevent overprocessing. Edmund has learned to judge the readiness of hides by smell, texture, and colour, skills that took years to develop and can't be taught from books. The actual tanning stage involves soaking prepared hides in solutions of ground oak bark and water. The tannins in the bark react with proteins in the hide to create leather, but the process is slow and requires multiple stages of increasing concentration. Edmund maintains dozens of tanning pits at different stages of the process, moving hides from weak solutions to stronger ones over a period of months. The bark must be ground fresh for each batch, a labour-intensive process that fills the air with dust that irritates the lungs and eyes. The physical demands of tanning are enormous. Wet hides can weigh hundreds of pounds and must be lifted, moved, and manipulated by hand. The constant exposure to moisture and chemicals causes Edmund's hands to crack and bleed, while the repetitive motions required for scraping and processing have given him joint problems that worsen every year. At 45, he moves like a much older man, his body worn down by decades of heavy labour in toxic conditions. The social isolation experienced by tanners was profound and institutionalised. Edmund lives in a district reserved for workers in smelly trades, along with fullers, dyers, and other craftsmen whose occupations produce offensive odours. He's banned from many taverns and shops, excluded from certain religious ceremonies, and avoided by respectable citizens who cross the street when they see him approaching. Even his professional relationships are strained by the nature of his work, as suppliers and customers prefer to conduct business quickly and at a distance. The economic aspects of tanning were complicated by the essential nature of the product and the revolting conditions required to produce it. Leather was crucial to medieval life, used for shoes, clothing, armour, saddles, book covers, and countless other necessities. This created steady demand for Edmund's services, but the limited number of people willing to work in such conditions meant that competition was minimal. He could charge premium prices for quality work, but the costs of maintaining his operation were substantial. The equipment required for tanning was extensive and required constant maintenance. Edmund owns dozens of wooden and stone containers for different stages of the process, each one designed for specific types of solutions or treatments. His scraping knives must be kept sharp and properly shaped, while his wooden beams and tools require regular replacement due to the corrosive effects of the chemicals used in tanning. The stone pits that form the heart of his operation need periodic repair and resealing to prevent leaks that could contaminate groundwater. The seasonal rhythms of tanning work created periods of intense activity, alternating with slower times that allowed for equipment maintenance and preparation. Spring brought fresh hides from animals that died during winter, while summer's heat accelerated chemical processes but made working conditions almost unbearable. Fall was the busiest season, as farmers slaughtered animals for winter food supplies and needed their hides processed quickly. Winter offered some relief from the heat but brought new challenges as solutions froze and had to be kept liquid through constant attention. The apprenticeship system in tanning was harsh but necessary for passing on the complex knowledge required for successful leather production. Boys usually entered the trade around age 12, beginning with simple tasks like maintaining fires and cleaning tools. The learning process involved gradual exposure to increasingly unpleasant aspects of the work, allowing apprentices to develop tolerance for the smells and conditions while mastering the technical skills needed for quality leather production. Edmund's current apprentice is a boy of 14, whose father died owing money to the local lord. The boy was bound to Edmund's service to work off the debt, but he shows little aptitude for the trade and frequently becomes sick from the smells and chemicals. Edmund wonders whether the apprentice will survive long enough to complete his training, or whether he'll join the ranks of young men who flee tanning for less revolting occupations. The health risks associated with tanning extended far beyond the obvious discomforts of working with rotting animal flesh and toxic chemicals. Edmund suffers from chronic respiratory problems caused by inhaling fumes and dust from his operation. His skin is permanently stained and scarred from chemical exposure, while his digestive system has been damaged by years of accidentally ingesting contaminated materials. Most tanners die young from diseases related to their occupation, though medieval medicine couldn't identify the specific causes of their ailments. The waste disposal problems created by tanning operations were enormous and largely unsolved by medieval technology. Edmund generates tons of organic waste annually, including scraped flesh, used chemicals, and contaminated water that must be disposed of somewhere. The runoff from his pits contaminates soil and groundwater for considerable distances, while the solid waste attracts scavengers and creates breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. The quality control required in leather production was exacting and unforgiving. Hides that weren't processed correctly would crack, rot, or fail to hold their shape when made into finished goods. Edmund has learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicate proper processing at each stage of the tanning process. But even experienced tanners sometimes lose entire batches to contamination, over-processing, or equipment failures. The business relationships required for successful tanning involve managing connections with suppliers of raw materials, customers who purchase finished leather, and authorities who regulated the trade. Edmund must maintain relationships with butchers, farmers, and knackers who provide hides, while also cultivating connections with leather workers, shoemakers, and other craftsmen who buy his products. These relationships are complicated by the social stigma attached to tanning and the natural reluctance of people to associate with someone whose profession is so offensive. The regulation of tanning operations was extensive and strictly enforced by local authorities concerned about public health and environmental contamination. Edmund holds licenses that permit him to operate his tanning yard, but these come with numerous restrictions about waste disposal, working hours, and the types of materials he can process. Violations can result in fines, temporary closure, or permanent loss of his right to practice the trade. The technological aspects of tanning remained relatively unchanged throughout the medieval period. Though minor improvements in tools and techniques were gradually adopted, Edmund uses methods that are essentially identical to those employed by tanners centuries earlier, relying on traditional knowledge passed down through generations of practitioners. Innovation was limited by the conservative nature of medieval society and the lack of scientific understanding about the chemical processes involved in leather production. The environmental impact of tanning operations was severe and long-lasting. The chemicals used in processing hides could contaminate soil and water for years after disposal, while the organic waste attracted scavengers and created conditions favourable to disease transmission. Medieval communities struggled to balance the economic necessity of leather production with the environmental and health costs of tanning operations. The storage and handling of raw materials required careful attention to prevent spoilage and contamination. Edmund must process fresh hides quickly to prevent decomposition, while also maintaining supplies of bark, lime, and other materials needed for the tanning process. The storage facilities must be designed to prevent theft, weather damage, and contamination while remaining accessible for daily operations. The pricing of leather goods reflected both the essential nature of the product and the revolting conditions required for its production. Edmund charges premium prices for high-quality leather, but his costs are substantial due to the materials, equipment, and labor required for proper tanning. The limited competition in his trade allows him to maintain profitable margins, but economic downturns can quickly reduce demand and force him to lower prices or find alternative markets for his products. The customer service aspects of tanning required Edmund to balance the technical requirements of leather production with the social sensitivities of clients who needed his services but found his profession disgusting. He's learned to conduct business efficiently and professionally while minimizing contact that might offend customers or damage his reputation. This delicate balance requires constant attention to social cues and customer preferences. The succession planning for tanning operations was complicated by the difficulty of finding qualified apprentices willing to enter such a revolting profession. Edmund has no sons to inherit his business, and recruiting young men from outside his family has become increasingly difficult as other occupations become available. The specialized knowledge he's accumulated over decades of practice may be lost if he can't successfully train a successor. The competition among tanners was limited but intense, as the small number of practitioners in any given area competed for supplies of quality hides and customers willing to pay premium prices. Edmund maintains his market position through reputation for quality work and reliable delivery, but he must constantly guard against competitors who might undercut his prices or steal his customers through superior service or lower standards. The insurance against business risks available to tanners was minimal and largely informal. Edmund has arrangements with other craftsmen to share equipment or materials during emergencies, but he has no protection against major losses due to fire, flood, or other disasters. The toxic nature of his operation makes such risks particularly devastating, as contamination could render his entire facility unusable for years. The record-keeping required for tanning operations involved tracking multiple batches of hides through various stages of processing over periods of months. Edmund maintains mental records of which hides are in which pits when they need to be moved to the next stage, and which customers have placed orders for specific types of leather. This information management requires constant attention and accuracy to prevent costly mistakes. The networking among tanners was essential for sharing information about suppliers, techniques, and market conditions. Edmund maintains relationships with other tanners in nearby communities that provide mutual support and information exchange. These connections help him stay informed about changes in hide quality, new processing methods, and shifts in customer demand that might affect his business. The adaptation to changing market conditions required flexibility and business acumen that went beyond leather production skills. Edmund monitors demand from different types of customers and adjusts his production priorities accordingly. When shoemakers reduce their leather purchases, he might focus more on supplying armor makers or bookbinders who continue buying despite economic changes. The waste heat recovery from tanning operations was one of the few environmental benefits of the process. The fermentation occurring in baiting pits generated heat that Edmund could use for other purposes, including warming his home during winter months. This heat recovery reduced his fuel costs and provided some compensation for the environmental damage caused by his operations. The pest control required in tanning yards was constant and often unsuccessful. The organic waste and standing water created ideal breeding conditions for flies, mosquitoes, and other insects that could spread disease or simply make working conditions unbearable. Edmund uses smoke, herbs, and physical barriers to control pests, but complete elimination is impossible given the nature of his materials. The fire prevention measures required in tanning operations were extensive due to the flammable nature of many materials used in the process. Edmund maintains careful separation between his heating areas and storage facilities, while also ensuring adequate water supplies for emergency use. A fire in a tanning yard could not only destroy the business, but also spread toxic smoke throughout the surrounding area. The chemical safety knowledge required for tanning was entirely empirical, based on observation and experience rather than scientific understanding. Edmund has learned which combinations of materials are dangerous, which fumes should be avoided, and which symptoms indicate serious exposure problems. This knowledge was gained through trial and error, often at considerable cost to his health and that of his workers. The community relations aspects of tanning required constant attention to minimize conflicts with neighbors and authorities. Edmund works to contain odors and waste as much as possible, schedules his most offensive operations for times when fewer people are likely to be affected, and maintains communication with local officials about his activities. These efforts help preserve his license to operate, but require significant time and resources. The transportation logistics for tanning operations involved moving heavy, bulky materials over considerable distances while minimizing contamination and odor problems. Edmund must arrange for delivery of raw hides, removal of finished leather, and disposal of waste materials using methods that don't create public disturbances or health hazards. This logistics management requires careful coordination and significant expense. The weather dependency of tanning operations created significant challenges for maintaining consistent production schedules. Rain could flood pits and dilute solutions, while extreme heat could accelerate chemical processes beyond optimal rates. Cold weather slowed reactions and made working conditions more difficult, while wind could spread odors and contamination over wider areas than usual. The professional hierarchy of medieval rat catching was more complex than you might imagine. While most people think of rat catchers as desperate individuals working alone with crude traps, the reality was far more organized and dangerous. The best rat catchers were skilled professionals who understood rodent behavior, could navigate the underground networks beneath medieval cities, and had developed techniques that kept them alive in one of the most hazardous occupations available. Geoffrey the rat catcher crouches in the narrow stone tunnel that runs beneath the grain market in Norwich, his oil lamp casting dancing shadows on walls that glisten with moisture and decades of accumulated filth. The tunnel is barely 4 feet high, forcing him to move in an uncomfortable crouch that has permanently bent his spine after 20 years in this profession. Behind him, his terrier bitch Molly pants quietly, her ears pricked forward as she scents the prey they're hunting. The smell down here is indescribable. It's not just the odor of rat droppings and urine, though that's certainly present in overwhelming quantities. It's the smell of decay, of stagnant water that hasn't seen sunlight in months, of organic waste that's been fermenting in the darkness. But Geoffrey has learned to use his nose as a tool, reading the different scents to track his quarry and identify potential dangers. The grain merchants above pay Geoffrey well for his services, but they prefer not to think too hard about how he earns his money. Rats in a granary can destroy tons of stored grain in a matter of weeks, turning profitable harvests into financial disasters. During times of scarcity, when grain prices soar and people go hungry, rat damage can mean the difference between prosperity and starvation for entire communities. Geoffrey carries a variety of tools suited to different hunting situations. His primary weapon is a short club weighted with lead, designed to kill rats quickly without damaging their pelts, which have value in the fur trade. He has wire snares for setting traps in rat runs, hooks for pulling dead rodents from inaccessible places, and a leather bag treated with herbs that supposedly mask human scent. But his most valuable tool is Molly, bred specifically for rat hunting and trained to work silently in confined spaces. The dangers of working in medieval sewers and tunnels went far beyond the obvious risks of rat bites and disease transmission. The underground spaces beneath medieval cities were poorly constructed, often collapsing without warning and trapping anyone unfortunate enough to be inside. Geoffrey has narrowly escaped several cave-ins over the years, and he knows of at least 3 rat catchers who weren't so lucky. The air quality in these tunnels could be deadly. Methane gas from decomposing organic matter could cause explosions if exposed to flame, while hydrogen sulfide could render a person unconscious in minutes. Geoffrey has learned to recognize the warning signs of dangerous gas buildup, but the symptoms often appear too late to prevent serious harm. He's been overcome by fumes twice, surviving only because Molly's barking attracted help from above ground. Water was another constant threat. Heavy rains could flood tunnel systems in minutes, turning narrow passages into death traps. Jeffrey has been caught in flash floods several times, once spending 6 hours clinging to a stone ledge while contaminated water rushed past just inches below his feet. The water in these tunnels wasn't just dirty, it was actively toxic, carrying diseases that could kill anyone who swallowed even small amounts. But perhaps the most insidious danger came from the rats themselves. Medieval rats carried diseases that modern medicine would recognize as bubonic plague, typhus, and various forms of food poisoning, though Jeffrey understood only that rat bites could lead to fever, swelling, and death. He's learned to read rat behavior well enough to avoid the most aggressive individuals, but in confined spaces, confrontations were inevitable. Jeffrey's technique for hunting rats in tunnels requires patience, stealth, and an intimate understanding of rodent psychology. Rats are intelligent creatures that learn to avoid areas where their companions have been killed. They post sentries while feeding, use multiple escape routes, and can detect human presence from considerable distances. Jeffrey must think like his prey, anticipating their movements and setting up situations where they have no choice but to come within range of his weapons. The partnership between Jeffrey and Molly represents years of training and mutual adaptation. The dog has learned to work silently, to follow hand signals in near total darkness, and to distinguish between different types of prey based on scent and sound. She can track rats through maze-like tunnel systems, corner them in dead-end passages, and kill multiple targets in rapid succession without alerting the rest of the colony. But Molly faces the same health risks as her human partner. Rat bites can transmit diseases to dogs as easily as to people, and Jeffrey has lost several hunting dogs over the years to infections that developed from seemingly minor wounds. The constant exposure to toxic environments takes its toll on animals as well as humans, shortening lifespans and reducing the working years available for training and partnership development. The social isolation experienced by rat catchers was profound and institutionalized. Jeffrey lives alone in a small house on the outskirts of Norwich, avoided by neighbors who fear that his profession makes him a carrier of disease. Children throw stones at him when he walks through town, while adults cross themselves and mutter prayers of protection. Even other workers in despised professions look down on rat catchers, considering them the lowest of the low. The church's attitude toward rat catching was complex and often contradictory. Some priests argued that killing God's creatures, even vermin, was spiritually questionable. Others maintained that protecting food supplies from destructive pests was a form of Christian service. Jeffrey attends church when he can, but he's aware that many parishioners believe his profession marks him as spiritually contaminated. The economic realities of rat catching created strange contradictions in Jeffrey's social status. During normal times, he's treated as an untouchable, barely tolerated by the community he serves, but during plague outbreaks or severe infestations, he becomes one of the most important people in the city. Wealthy merchants who normally wouldn't acknowledge his existence suddenly compete for his services, offering premium payments for immediate attention to their properties. The seasonal patterns of rat activity required Jeffrey to adjust his techniques and strategies throughout the year. Spring brought increased breeding activity as rats emerged from winter shelters to establish new colonies. Summer heat drove rats to seek cooler underground spaces, making tunnel hunting more productive but also more dangerous, as confined spaces became even more toxic. Fall brought frantic feeding activity as rats prepared for winter, while cold weather forced them into human buildings, where they could be more easily hunted, but also cause more direct damage. The apprenticeship system in rat catching was informal and often interrupted by the high mortality rate among practitioners. Jeffrey learned the trade from an older man who died of fever after a particularly severe rat bite became infected. The training process involved gradual exposure to increasingly dangerous situations, starting with simple trap setting and progressing to tunnel hunting only after years of preparation. Jeffrey's current apprentice is a boy whose parents died in the last plague outbreak, leaving him with no other options for survival. The child shows promise, but struggles with the claustrophobic conditions in underground spaces and has already suffered several minor injuries from rat bites. Jeffrey wonders whether the boy will survive long enough to master the trade, or whether he'll join the ranks of apprentices who fled to find less dangerous work. The equipment maintenance required for rat catching was constant and expensive. Jeffrey's clubs and traps must be kept in perfect condition, as equipment failure in a dangerous situation could be fatal. His lamp requires regular cleaning and fuel replenishment, while his protective clothing needs frequent repair and replacement due to the corrosive effects of the environments where he works. The breeding and training of rat hunting dogs represented a significant investment that could be lost to disease or accident at any time. Jeffrey maintains bloodlines of terriers specifically bred for underground work. But the health risks faced by these animals mean that breeding programs are constantly disrupted by mortality. A good rat hunting dog represents years of training and substantial financial investment, making their loss particularly devastating. The disposal of killed rats created its own set of problems and opportunities. The pelts had some value in the fur trade, though rat fur was considered inferior to other types. The bodies could be sold to tanners who used various animal parts in their processes, or to folk healers who believed rat organs had medicinal properties. But disposal had to be handled carefully to prevent the spread of disease or contamination of food supplies. The territorial aspects of rat catching created conflicts among practitioners competing for the most lucrative contracts. Jeffrey has established relationships with certain merchants and property owners that provide steady income. But these relationships must be constantly maintained and defended against competitors who might offer lower prices or faster service. The informal nature of these business arrangements provides little protection against unfair competition or contract disputes. The record-keeping required for effective rat catching involved tracking infestation patterns, seasonal variations, and the effectiveness of different techniques in various locations. Jeffrey maintains mental maps of tunnel systems, noting which areas are most productive, which ones are particularly dangerous, and which ones might be suitable for apprentice training. This knowledge represents years of accumulated experience that would be lost if he died suddenly. The customer relations aspects of rat catching required Jeffrey to balance effectiveness with discretion. Wealthy clients want their rat problems solved quickly and quietly, without public acknowledgement that they have infestations. Jeffrey has learned to work efficiently while maintaining the fiction that respectable properties don't harbour vermin, entering and leaving buildings at times when his presence is least likely to be noticed. The health monitoring required for rat catchers was primitive but essential for survival in such a hazardous profession. Jeffrey has learned to recognise the early symptoms of diseases transmitted by rats, though his understanding of these conditions is based on observation rather than medical knowledge. He treats minor injuries with herbal remedies and seeks help from healers only when problems become severe enough to threaten his ability to work. The networking among rat catchers was essential for sharing information about effective techniques, dangerous locations, and market opportunities. Jeffrey maintains relationships with other practitioners in nearby communities that provide mutual support and information exchange. These connections help him stay informed about new infestation patterns, changes in customer demand, and innovations in hunting techniques. The insurance against business risks available to rat catchers was minimal and largely dependent on personal relationships. Jeffrey has informal arrangements with other craftsmen to provide mutual assistance during emergencies, but he has no protection against major losses due to injury, illness, or equipment failure. The dangerous nature of his work makes such risks constant threats to his livelihood. The innovation in rat-catching techniques was driven by necessity and competition rather than formal research or development. Jeffrey has developed improvements to standard traps and hunting methods based on his observations of rat behavior and the specific challenges of working in Norwich's tunnel systems. These innovations are closely guarded trade secrets that provide competitive advantages over other rat catchers. The legal status of rat catchers was generally unregulated, but they sometimes faced restrictions on their methods or working areas. Geoffrey occasionally encounters problems with property owners who object to his presence or techniques, though most recognize that his services are essential for protecting their investments. Some communities have regulations governing the disposal of dead rats or the use of certain types of traps. The succession planning for rat-catching knowledge was complicated by the high mortality rate and social isolation experienced by practitioners. Geoffrey has no family to inherit his knowledge and techniques, and training apprentices is difficult when most young people flee the profession as soon as they find alternatives. The specialized skills he's developed over decades of practice may be lost when he dies or becomes unable to work. The environmental impact of rat catching was generally positive from the perspective of medieval communities, as it helped control populations of destructive pests and disease carriers. However, the methods used sometimes had unintended consequences, such as killing beneficial animals that were caught in traps intended for rats, or contaminating water supplies with poison baits. The psychological toll of rat catching was severe and largely unrecognized by medieval society. Geoffrey deals with constant fear, social rejection, and the knowledge that his work could kill him at any time. The isolation and stress of his profession have affected his personality and worldview, making him suspicious of others and pessimistic about his future prospects. The weather dependency of rat catching created significant variations in working conditions and income potential. Heavy rains could flood tunnel systems and make underground work impossible, while drought could force rats to seek water sources that made them easier to track and trap. Extreme temperatures affected both rat behavior and the safety of working in confined spaces. The competition with other pest control methods was beginning to emerge during Geoffrey's career, as some communities experimented with cats, improved building techniques, and other approaches to rat control. These alternatives threatened to reduce demand for traditional rat-catching services, forcing practitioners to adapt their methods or find new markets for their skills. The quality control required in rat catching involved not just killing rats, but ensuring that infestations were completely eliminated and unlikely to recur. Geoffrey has learned to identify and eliminate breeding sites, block access routes, and modify environments to make them less attractive to future infestations. This comprehensive approach requires more time and skill than simple rat killing, but provides better long-term results for customers. The storage and handling of rat-catching equipment required attention to hygiene and disease prevention. Geoffrey's tools and clothing become contaminated during use and must be cleaned and treated to prevent the spread of disease. His work area at home is isolated from living spaces and designed to contain contamination while allowing for proper equipment maintenance. The transportation logistics for rat catching involved moving equipment and captured rats through communities that preferred not to acknowledge the presence of vermin. Geoffrey has learned to work discreetly, using back alleys and off-peak hours to avoid creating public disturbances, or reminding people of problems they'd rather ignore. The market fluctuations affecting rat-catching services were tied to agricultural cycles, trade patterns, and disease outbreaks that influence both rat populations and community awareness of pest problems. Geoffrey's income varies dramatically based on factors beyond his control, requiring careful financial management during prosperous periods to survive lean times when work is scarce. The professional development opportunities available to rat catchers were limited to informal knowledge sharing and self-directed experimentation. Geoffrey has learned advanced techniques through trial and error, observation of rat behavior, and occasional conversations with other practitioners. There are no formal training programs or apprenticeship standards that might improve safety or effectiveness in the profession. But despite all these challenges and dangers, Geoffrey continues his work with a grim determination born of necessity and a strange form of professional pride. He knows that his services are essential to the community that shuns him, that his skills protect food supplies and prevent disease outbreaks that could kill thousands. In the dark tunnels beneath Norwich, armed with nothing but primitive weapons and the loyalty of his dog, he wages a daily war against creatures that threaten the foundations of medieval urban life. The irony of Geoffrey's situation is that his success in controlling rat populations makes his work less visible and appreciated. When he does his job well, people forget why they need him. When infestations occur, they blame him for not preventing them. It's a profession that offers little recognition for success, but plenty of criticism for failure, performed by people who have no choice but to risk their lives in service of communities that would prefer to pretend they don't exist. Tomorrow we'll encounter a profession that makes rat catching look almost pleasant by comparison. During the plague years that periodically devastated medieval Europe, a new category of worker emerged from desperate necessity: the plague barrier, men and women who collected the bodies of the dead and disposed of them in mass graves while facing mortality rates that made their profession almost suicidal. But first, let's meet the sin eaters, individuals who performed one of the strangest and most psychologically disturbing jobs in medieval society, literally consuming the sins of the dead through ritual meals eaten over corpses. The practice of sin eating represents one of the most bizarre intersections of religion, superstition, and social outcasting in medieval Europe. While not as widespread as other professions we've discussed, sin eaters filled a psychological need in communities struggling with concepts of salvation, damnation, and the fate of souls after death. Silas the Sin Eater stands at the threshold of a stone cottage in the Welsh countryside, clutching a wooden bowl and a piece of stale bread. Inside, the body of Morgan the Miller lies on a rough wooden table, surrounded by his grieving family. They've called Silas because Morgan died suddenly, without receiving last rites, and they fear his soul carries the burden of unconfessed sins that might prevent his entry into heaven. The ritual Silas is about to perform is ancient, controversial, and deeply disturbing to many church authorities. By eating a meal placed upon or near the corpse, he will symbolically consume the dead person's sins, transferring their spiritual burden to himself. It's a transaction that offers comfort to the grieving family, while condemning Silas to carry an ever-growing load of spiritual contamination that most people believe will damn his own soul. The theological basis for sin eating was never officially recognized by the church, but it persisted in rural areas where older beliefs mixed with Christian doctrine to create hybrid practices that served psychological needs the official religion couldn't address. People needed to believe that their loved ones could achieve salvation, even if they died without proper preparation, and sin eating provided a mechanism for posthumous redemption that eased the grief of survivors. Silas learned this profession from his father, who inherited it from his grandfather in an unbroken line stretching back generations. The knowledge passed down through his family includes not just the ritual procedures, but an understanding of the psychological dynamics involved in dealing with grief-stricken families and the spiritual implications of taking on other people's sins. The actual ceremony varies depending on local traditions and the specific circumstances of the death. In this case, Silas will sit beside Morgan's body while the family places bread, cheese, and ale on the corpse's chest. He'll consume this meal slowly and solemnly, speaking ritual words that formally transfer the dead man's sins to himself. The family will then pay him a small fee and escort him from the house, often ensuring that he leaves by a different door than the one he entered. The social isolation experienced by sin eaters was more complete than that faced by any other profession we've encountered. Silas lives alone in a hovel on the outskirts of the village, shunned by everyone except those desperate enough to require his services. Children flee when they see him approaching. Adults cross themselves and mutter protective prayers. And even other social outcasts avoid contact with someone they believe carries the accumulated sins of dozens of dead people. The psychological toll of sin eating is almost impossible to imagine. Silas genuinely believes that he carries the spiritual burden of every person whose sins he has consumed, a load that grows heavier with each ceremony he performs. He lives with the constant knowledge that his own soul is forfeit, that he has sacrificed his chance of salvation to provide comfort for others. This creates a form of existential despair that affects every aspect of his daily life. The economic aspects of sin eating were modest, but necessary for Silas's survival. Families typically pay him with food, small amounts of money, or occasionally clothing and household items. The payments are always minimal, reflecting both the poverty of rural communities and the ambivalent feelings people have towards someone who performs such a disturbing service. Silas survives on these payments, supplemented by occasional work as a labourer when his reputation doesn't precede him. The religious controversy surrounding sin eating created ongoing tensions between Silas and church authorities. Local priests generally opposed the practice as heretical, arguing that only God could forgive sins and that human beings couldn't transfer spiritual burdens from one person to another. But the emotional needs of parishioners often overrode theological objections, leading to an uneasy coexistence between official doctrine and popular practice. Silas faces additional complications when deaths occur during periods of strict religious observance, or when church authorities are particularly active in suppressing folk practices. He's been threatened with excommunication, physically attacked by zealous Christians, and occasionally forced to flee communities where his presence becomes too controversial. These conflicts add another layer of stress to an already difficult existence. The training required for sin eating involves more than learning ritual procedures. Silas had to develop the psychological resilience necessary to face grief-stricken families, the spiritual fortitude to accept damnation as the price of his service, and the social skills needed to navigate complex emotional situations while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. The equipment used in sin eating is simple, but symbolically important. Silas owns a special wooden bowl and spoon used only for these ceremonies, along with ritual clothing that marks him as a sin eater during formal occasions. These items are considered contaminated by association with death and sin, adding to his social isolation and making it difficult for him to obtain replacements when they wear out. The seasonal patterns of sin-eating work reflect the natural rhythms of mortality in medieval communities. Winter brings increased deaths from cold, disease and malnutrition, creating more demand for Silas's services. Summer epidemics can generate sudden surges in business, while spring and fall typically offer quieter periods that allow him to supplement his income with other work. The geographical mobility required for sin eating creates additional challenges for practitioners like Silas. Rural communities can't support full-time sin eaters, so he must travel between villages to find enough work to survive. This wandering lifestyle adds to his isolation and makes it difficult to establish the relationships necessary for regular employment in other occupations. The succession planning for sin-eating knowledge is complicated by the reluctance of young people to enter such a spiritually dangerous profession. Silas has no sons to inherit his role, and finding apprentices willing to accept damnation in exchange for a marginally sustainable living is increasingly difficult. The specialized knowledge and ritual procedures he's learned may die with him. The legal status of sin eating varies by location and the attitudes of local authorities. In some areas, the practice is tolerated as a harmless folk custom. In others, it's actively suppressed as heretical or dangerous to public order. Silas must carefully assess the religious and political climate in each community before offering his services. The health risks associated with sin eating extend beyond spiritual concerns to include physical dangers from consuming food that has been in contact with corpses. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited, But Silas has learned to avoid situations where the dead person died of obviously contagious conditions. Still, the risk of infection from contaminated food remains constant. The customer relations aspects of sin eating require extraordinary sensitivity to grief, religious belief, and family dynamics. Silas must provide comfort to people in extreme emotional distress while performing rituals that many find disturbing or theologically questionable. He's learned to read family situations quickly, adapting his approach to match their specific needs and beliefs. The record-keeping required for sin eating is minimal, but psychologically significant. Silas maintains mental records of every person whose sins he has consumed, partly for practical reasons related to payment and scheduling, but mainly because he feels responsible for carrying their spiritual burdens. This psychological inventory grows heavier with each ceremony he performs. The networking among sin eaters is limited by their geographic dispersion and social isolation. Silas occasionally encounters other practitioners during his travels, but these meetings are rare and often brief. The sharing of techniques and experiences provides some psychological support, but the fundamental isolation of the profession means that most sin eaters work alone. The innovation in sin eating practices is constrained by the traditional nature of the rituals and the conservative attitudes of the communities served. Silas has made minor adjustments to ceremonies based on specific family requests or local customs, but the basic procedures remain unchanged from those taught by his father and grandfather. The competition among sin eaters is minimal due to the limited number of practitioners and the geographical dispersion of demand. Silas occasionally encounters situations where families have options between different sin eaters, but these choices are usually based on availability rather than competitive factors like price or service quality. The insurance against business risks available to sin eaters is non-existent, reflecting their complete social isolation and the controversial nature of their work. Silas has no colleagues to provide backup during illness or injury, no family support network, and no community resources to fall back on during difficult times. The environmental impact of sin eating is minimal, but the disposal of contaminated ritual items creates minor problems. Silas must carefully dispose of bowls, utensils, and clothing that have been used in ceremonies, as these items are considered spiritually contaminated and potentially dangerous to others. This disposal is usually accomplished through burial or burning in isolated locations. The technological aspects of sin eating remain unchanged throughout the medieval period, as the profession depends on ritual procedures rather than tools or techniques that might be improved through innovation. The basic elements of bread, drink, and ceremonial consumption provide no opportunities for technological advancement. The quality control required in sin eating involves maintaining the dignity and effectiveness of ceremonies, while adapting to specific family needs and beliefs. Silas must balance respect for traditional procedures with sensitivity to local customs and individual preferences, ensuring that families feel their loved ones have been properly served. The marketing of sin eating services is accomplished entirely through word-of-mouth communication within communities where the practice is accepted. Silas cannot advertise his services openly due to religious opposition, instead depending on referrals from satisfied families and knowledge of his availability passed through informal networks. The storage and maintenance of sin eating equipment requires attention to both practical and spiritual considerations. Silas keeps his ritual items in a separate area of his dwelling, away from everyday objects, and treats them with special care to preserve their ceremonial significance. The contaminated nature of these items makes replacement difficult when they wear out. The transportation logistics for sin eating involve carrying ritual equipment between communities while maintaining its ceremonial purity and avoiding conflicts with religious authorities who might object to its presence. Silas has learned to travel discreetly, often arriving and departing under cover of darkness to minimize controversy. The weather dependency of sin eating creates seasonal variations in working conditions that affect both the comfort of ceremonies and the travel required to reach clients. Winter weather can make travel dangerous or impossible, while summer heat accelerates decomposition and makes working with corpses more unpleasant and potentially hazardous. The adaptation to changing religious attitudes requires sin eaters to monitor shifts in church policy and community sentiment that might affect their ability to practice their profession. Silas must be prepared to modify his approach or temporarily cease operations when religious authorities become particularly active in suppressing folk practices. The waste management issues associated with sin eating are minimal but symbolically important. Food remnants from ceremonies cannot be disposed of casually, as they are considered to carry spiritual contamination. Silas typically buries these materials in isolated locations or burns them completely to prevent accidental contact by others. The professional development opportunities available to sin eaters are limited to informal knowledge sharing and personal reflection on the effectiveness of different ritual approaches. Silas has refined his techniques over years of practice, but there are no formal training programs or standardized procedures that might improve the profession. The economic fluctuations affecting sin-eating services reflect broader patterns of mortality, religious observance, and community prosperity that influence both the demand for services and families' ability to pay for them. Silas's income varies dramatically based on factors beyond his control, requiring careful resource management during lean periods. The community impact of sin eating extends beyond individual families to affect broader attitudes toward death, salvation, and spiritual responsibility within medieval communities. Silas's presence in a village serves as a constant reminder of mortality and the precarious nature of salvation, creating psychological tensions that influence how people think about life, death, and their relationships with God. The theological debates surrounding sin-eating often expose deeper conflicts within medieval Christianity about the nature of salvation, the power of ritual, and the role of intermediaries between humans and the divine. Silas finds himself at the center of these controversies, serving as a lightning rod for arguments about orthodox belief and popular practice that have profound implications for community cohesion. The family dynamics surrounding sin-eating ceremonies reveal the complex emotional and social pressures faced by medieval people dealing with death and grief. Silas has observed how different families handle the tension between their desire for their loved one's salvation and their discomfort with practices that challenge official church teaching. These observations have given him unique insights into human nature and the psychology of belief. The ritual significance of sin-eating extends beyond its immediate purpose to encompass broader themes of sacrifice, redemption, and communal responsibility that resonate throughout medieval culture. Silas understands that his role involves more than simply consuming food, that he serves as a scapegoat figure who bears the community's collective anxiety about sin and salvation. The historical continuity of sin-eating practices connects medieval communities to pre-Christian traditions that emphasize the importance of proper treatment for the dead and the ongoing relationship between the living and deceased. Silas carries forward ancient customs that provide psychological comfort in ways that newer religious practices sometimes fail to address. The gender aspects of sin-eating reveal interesting patterns in how medieval society assigned roles related to death and spiritual danger. While most sin-eaters were men, some women entered the profession, particularly widows who had few other options for survival. These female practitioners faced additional challenges related to their gender and the suspicions it aroused about their spiritual purity. The regional variations in sin-eating practices reflect the diverse cultural landscapes of medieval Europe, where local customs mixed with broader religious traditions to create unique hybrid forms. Silas has encountered different versions of the basic ritual during his travels, each adapted to specific community beliefs and historical experiences. The documentation of sin-eating in medieval records is sparse and often hostile, reflecting the controversial nature of the practice and the literacy levels of the communities where it occurred. Silas's work leaves little historical trace beyond occasional references in church records condemning the practice or legal documents mentioning payments to sin eaters. The psychological preparation required for sin eating involves developing unusual mental resilience and spiritual fortitude that allows practitioners to function despite carrying what they believe to be enormous spiritual burdens. Silas has developed coping mechanisms that help him manage the psychological weight of his profession, though the fundamental stress never entirely disappears. The social boundaries created by sin eating extend beyond simple avoidance to encompass complex systems of ritual pollution and purification that affect how communities organize themselves spatially and socially. Silas's presence in a village influences settlement patterns, social interactions, and even economic relationships in ways that reflect deep-seated beliefs about contamination and holiness. The economic efficiency of sin eating as a profession is questionable, given the minimal payments involved and the extensive social costs imposed on practitioners. Silas survives on the margins of medieval economy, earning just enough to maintain basic subsistence, while sacrificing any hope of prosperity or social advancement. The training methodology for sin eating relies entirely on oral tradition and hands-on experience. As the controversial nature of the practice prevents the development of formal educational systems, Silas learned by observing his father's work and gradually taking on more responsibility as he demonstrated competence and commitment to the profession. The retirement planning available to sin eaters is non-existent, as the social isolation and spiritual contamination associated with the profession prevent practitioners from accumulating resources or developing relationships that might support them in old age. Silas faces the prospect of working until he dies or becomes physically incapable of performing ceremonies. The legal protections available to sin eaters are minimal and often contradictory, as communities simultaneously depend on their services and question their legitimacy. Silas must navigate complex legal environments where his work might be tolerated, encouraged, or actively prosecuted, depending on local authorities and changing political circumstances. The health monitoring required for sin eaters involves more than physical concerns to encompass spiritual and psychological wellness in the face of extraordinary stress and isolation. Silas has developed personal practices that help him maintain mental stability, though the cumulative effects of his profession inevitably take their toll over time. The risk management strategies employed by sin eaters focus on minimizing conflicts with religious authorities while maintaining availability for families who need their services. Silas has learned to read community dynamics and religious climate to avoid situations that might result in persecution or violence,